what you guys do.
And now going to go to broadcasting. Okay, it's broadcasting to anyone who happens to be attending on Zoom. Now let me take us live on Facebook. So many steps. Here we are. Share in group. Cosmic Campfire Book Club.
All right.
And getting there. Let's see here. Any moment now.
Okay.
All right, I believe that we are now live. Welcome, Cosmic Campers, to another conversation with another awesome contributor to the book, How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere. It's like a veritable big tent camp meeting of panentheistic testimonials.
We are.
And we're so happy today to have Sister and Dr. Ilia Delio with us.
Hello.
Thank you. And for those of you who are not aware, Ilia is a Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C., and she is a theologian who brings a unique blend of a scientific background and a theological and contemplative background to her work. She currently holds the Josephine Connolly Endowed Chair of Theology at Villanova University, and is the author of 17 books. A lot of them are award-winning, including A Hunger for Wholeness, Soul, Space, and Transcendence, and The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, God, Evolution, and the Power of Love. I first encountered your work, Ilia, in 2011. I read The Emergent Christ.
Oh.
And that really rocked my world, turned my Christology inside out. I was probably, sort of from growing up fundamentalist, but, being involved for many years in the emerging church conversation, I was like, yeah, I think I accept evolution, but I never quite reckoned with how it could impact my theology and spirituality.
Yes. Right, yeah. Well, I'm glad I can make a dent there.
Absolutely. It was a game changer. And I've read, far too little of your work since then. And, in preparation for this, of course, read your chapter. I've listened to a couple of your interviews with friends of mine, Tripp Fuller, of course, with Homebrewed Christianity, as well as Micah Redding with the Christian Transhumanist Association.
Yes.
Where I currently serve on the board. Micah's an old friend.
Oh, great. Yeah. Great guy, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's so many places that we can go with all of this. And in some ways, I don't even want to try to top those interviews. I've actually shared links with them in our group. But I would love for you to maybe tell us something about yourself and your journey. Specifically, how does one go from having a New Jersey Catholic upbringing to studies in pharmacology, to a traditionalist Carmelite monastic life, to a Franciscan milieu with a penchant for medievalism and second axial age understandings of God and the cosmos? Like, how does that even all fit together in one life?
It is a strange concoction, I have to admit. But I guess being from New Jersey begins, that's the thing. When you're from New Jersey, it's possible, really. So I was trained as a scientist. I went to Seton Hall University and then Rutgers University, and I was at New Jersey Medical School for 5 years. And I love science, truthfully. My area was brain and spinal cord, so I worked a lot with cat spinal cord and trying to understand the basis for Lou Gehrig's disease, some of the dysfunction of Lou Gehrig's disease. So my real hope was to kind of find the cure to Lou Gehrig's disease and win a Nobel Prize and retire early, but that didn't. So I came across the life of Thomas Merton, and I never heard of him, and I was really intrigued by his life of He was very worldly, and I was very worldly. In fact, I was thinking the other day, actually, I don't know if I should say this on air, but I actually was a follower of Leon Trotsky in part of my career.
Oh
So
my.
I was always kind of a revolutionary thinker,
Yeah.
always thinking big. So I don't know, maybe because I have a Jersey kind of, kind of inferiority complex of some sort. So always thinking, the revolution, things can't stay as they are. There's a need to move forward. Anyway, when I ran into Merton, he was a big thinker who made radical decisions in his life. And his life I found very inspirational, and decided to kind of follow his path, having finished the PhD in pharmacology. And instead of going off to Hopkins for a postdoctoral experience in neurology, I went to this Dieskels Carmelite monastery.
Hmm.
So everyone thought maybe I was in the lab just entirely too long, or, you just were too hard. But I actually loved monastic life to some degree. There's a real rhythm to the monastic life. The balance between prayer and work and community is really a very wonderful thing, ideally. But I felt the monastery was too closed off from the world. I kind of struggled with the whole idea of like Jesus, like why would God send God's son into the world, and why would we leave the world? If Jesus is about bringing God to the world, in other words, to people, into the things. So I took a leave of absence and was sent to live with German Franciscan sisters in New Jersey. And I thought, wow, I said, well, I have a vow of silence, so I don't have to talk to anyone. I went back to do a postdoc at Rutgers University, and I lived with the German Franciscans for a year, and the reason I liked them, two things, really. They drank beer on Sundays, German, and they had little parties, little gatherings, and I thought that was kind of fun. So I joined them, and so I was really thinking, as to be a scientist. I wasn't thinking to be anything else, but when I joined the Franciscans, I had to redo formation of what we call the novitiate, sort of like boot camp,
Hmm.
So, like sister boot camp. And our novice director was having some sort of midlife crisis. I think I drove her into it, actually, because I was constantly asking questions, disagreeing with her. And so she was sent off to a program in the Midwest. And I was called in and asked if I wanted to study spirituality. And I said, oh my God, what is spirituality? Like, why would I study that?
Wow.
And I said, well, maybe, I think theology has a bit more, something to it. Yeah, because I had to take 2 theology courses in college, and they're like, fine, study theology. So I went to Fordham University, and then I wound up studying with Dr. Ewart Cousins. And I think he was my game changer. Because Ewart was just a fabulous person, and just a wonderful, really, I would say, an illuminative scholar, just a breadth of knowledge from the early church. He was a medieval philosopher by training in Bonaventure, and then, was very steeped in Teilhard de Chardin and Alfred North Whitehead in process theology. So we would have long, long conversations that would scan the 5th century, the 13th century, the 20th century, and then back to the 13th century. And he was like Etch-a-Sketch, you kind of followed along with him. And so it's from Ewart, I think, I began to think of theology in more integrative terms, rather than kind of a linear analysis of things, as most systematic theologians sort of do. So Ewart was unique, and I think with his influence, I did my studies in Bonaventure, but I wrote a chapter in my dissertation on Teilhard de Chardin, and I compared their Christologies, their Christocentrisms. And that was sort of my foray into Teilhard de Chardin. And then when I went to get a job, you really have to get a real job. I was like, what? I have to get a job? So the sisters are like, yes, you must either teach or you have to work at the nursing home. I was like, well, I guess I'll teach. So my first job was teaching science and religion, a course in science and religion at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut.
Okay.
not really knowing that science and religion had been a growing field since the 60s,
Mm-hmm.
certainly since Ian Barber launched with his famous book on science and religion, his method. So I kind of stepped into the waters of science and religion, but as a Franciscan theologian. And so I've always brought, I think, this very strange mix of Franciscan theology into this discussion of science and religion. And no one really knows it, but it's always in the background. Like everything I'm doing really has Francis and Bonaventure in the background of it. It's kind of neat.
And for those of us who are, Protestant, and we might not be as familiar with Franciscan theology, what comes to mind for me is Francis and Clare, a veneration for nature, a sort of a religious or spiritual naturalism that maybe is different than other monastic orders or emphases of Catholic theology. Is that accurate? Or
yeah, I think that's really accurate. I think three things. One, I think Francis himself was very, very theocentric. His whole idea was like God has come to us, that we don't have to go to God because God has come to us. That is the good news, of Jesus Christ. So he was, saw himself as a follower on the footsteps of Jesus, but his whole orientation was to become, like you might say, immersed in God, to be in that heart of God. Yes, and he had a great sense of nature mysticism, that creation is holy, creation is sacred, because of the incarnation, because of Jesus Christ, right? Because God has come to us. And that was the sum of the good news. And he placed a heavy emphasis on the crucified Christ, but not in the terms of like the, kind of the Calvinist or Lutheran idea, like we're sinners and, standing under the cross. For Francis, the cross was the explosion of God's love. That's where he saw God truly revealed. And so he wanted to live what we might call crucified love. The shape of love is, in a sense, through suffering with and for others. So that kind of, for me, Franciscan theology and why it spills into science and religion really comes from Bonaventure and Duns Scotus' notion of the primacy of Christ, that whether or not sin ever existed, Christ would have come. And that's still like a big shocker for us. Like, what? Like we're pretty sure Jesus is the reason for the season because, of our sins. And
the season of sin.
Yeah, right. And so SCOTUS was like, oh no, like it's such a great event. Like, why would God do something so incredible, like become one of us because of a defect in creation? That makes like absolutely no sense whatsoever. Like Jesus is not plan B, Right. So SCOTUS had one plan. God is love. God will to share that love, in a finite way, and therefore Jesus is first in God's intention to love and to create. And so that has been a guiding force for me. And Bonaventure held that to some degree as well. So a lot of my work really, that's why I like Teilhard de Chardin, because of his own Christogenic focus of science and religion, that they must work together for the unity of a whole, which he saw as the building up of the Christ.
Got it. And so, yeah, you said a lot there. And, with this Christocentrism, one thing that comes to mind, all the essays in How I Found God and Everyone and Everywhere, most of them are talking about this sort of panentheistic idea where God permeates all of reality and yet in some way is transcendent of that reality. And I kind of wonder, in a panentheistic world, is the incarnation redundant? Like why become a human if God is already every blade of grass, every human being, everything else? Or is that a different understanding of panentheism than you hold?
Yeah, no, I think panentheism actually flows from the incarnation. I think, for example, I don't think we could hold, say, to a Spinoza's God as panentheistic, or certainly Descartes' God, because classic deism or pantheism would not have God in things and things in God, but God more than things and things not God. So that's what we're talking about here, right? God is in all things and all things are in God, but God is not all things and all things are not God, and that's what we call a mystery, a coincidence of opposites, however you want to look at it, right? I might put it this way, really simply. God is in all things, but God spills over everything, right? Anything that God is in, God is always more because God is God, right? And so if we only say God is the leaf or God is the tree, wow, really? Poor little God. God is shrunk wrapped, into a leaf. But we can say that God is in the leaf and the leaf is in God, but God is, the name God, it's a name, right? So it's a name that points to an unfathomable mystery of unquenchable love or, inestimable goodness. Like there's no human mind that could ever get itself wrapped around the infinite or eternal goodness or love that God is. And we're saying that all that God is in this leaf or this person or this tree. But God is spilling over everything that is. So that's why I like panentheism compared to pantheism. But I think there's an element of pantheism in it. We are saying that God is in, right? God is in the person, in the tree. So it's kind of an incredible. I don't think truthfully, intellectually, we can get our heads around it. You have to grasp this mystery out of a different center.
Right. And for you as someone who is a Jesus follower, Jesus enthusiast, what have you, a Christ acknowledger, is there more Jesus? Was Jesus a unique singularity of this illustrating this God as all in allness in one human frame?
Yeah, I think with Jesus, I think he is that human person who you might say had that deep consciousness of God's explosive presence, and he acted out of you might say, a new consciousness, a new mind, and a new heart. He had a deep sense that God, like the reign of God is now, it's here. God is breaking in. And of course, everyone thought he was out of his mind, because this was like, really, dude, you can't be serious, right? And so I think that's what marks him as unique, or as Karl Rahner says, the whole evolutionary upslope is God gifting, God's self to creation. God, said, and Jesus is the great yes to that gift. Like the gift is finally received and responded to, in a fullest way.
Yes. And I'll have a question toward the very end of our conversation about other ways in which that particularity or specificity shows up within maybe a larger universality, especially in a pluralistic world and an interfaith world. But for now, I actually want to take this in a little bit different direction. For the fundamentalists in the back row, and admittedly, there aren't probably many in this group, but most of us have fundamentalists, conservative evangelicals that we love, who are in our lives.
Sure.
And, recently over the holidays, I got to spend time with some old friends of mine that I knew from high school. One of whom we were the best men in each other's weddings, very close. And over the years, we've drifted apart a bit, and some of the wedge has been different theological or spiritual understandings of the world. He is now a nationally renowned campus minister, worship leader, actually travels all over the world. I'm doing work in more contemplative field. And recently I've been sharing some of my writings with him. I'm in the process of co-launching an eco-spirituality nonprofit called Rewilder. And one of our projects is this anthropological reading of scripture, looking at especially Genesis, how it contains the echo of a memory of our transition from being immediate return foragers, hunter-gatherers, to being more sedentary agrarians, and the kind of impact that had on our development as a species, and how Fertile Crescent religion, agrarian religion, like our monotheistic traditions, were indelibly marked by that transition, and what we can learn from that. And so, I find it really interesting. I'm kind of nerding out on it. I share some of this with my old friend, and what he tells me over the holidays is, he's like, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Like if I were to embrace evolution, if I were to embrace, an earth that's been around for billions of years, this all makes sense. I think it's actually making me more of a young Earth creationist. And I was like, I was stunned. I was like, wow, okay. And you know, right. And so, you know, then I started talking with his older brother, who's a couple years older, who has a little bit more of a seminary education and background, admittedly in like a conservative reformed context.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, he said something similar. He said, you know, I can potentially accept that that early Genesis is poetry, but I can't accept that we have descended from great apes, because, you know, evolution is red in tooth and claw. It's this constant upheaval of violence, and revelation through scripture teaches that sin and death entered the world through Adam. So how could there be, you know, death in our lineage before, you know, before Adam? And so, you know, the one brother is like, if Adam and Eve aren't historical people, then everything else that happens later in scripture is a lie and it's untrustworthy. You know, the older brother is like, you know, has these objections about sin and death. So do you still encounter objections like this in your work, where people are kind of hardened around their idea of what constitutes revelation and how that might stand in the way of scientific thinking or even creative thinking?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is an important question, actually. And I did cover, I mean, I teach a course this semester. I've been teaching a course on foundations of theology, and this was a quite heated topic in a class a few weeks ago. And it's very hard because the story of Adam and Eve and the concept of original sin is deeply, deeply enmeshed in religion, Christian thinking. It's sort of like DNA'd in, you know, and genetically wired. And so it's hard for us really to get our heads around the fact that this is not a literal story, but it's a story, actually, an interpretation, certainly, of Genesis. And then if you look at the origin of original sin, which really comes not in the Gospels, but it comes actually with Augustine, you know, and Augustine, and then given the imprimatur by Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. So this is, first of all, not a New Testament idea. This is an interpretation, you know, kind of what we say interpolated into the New Testament. I think it is very problematic to once at this point to extrapolate science and religious belief as if science is inconsequential, or, you know, we really shouldn't take this too seriously. I find that very, very difficult in one way. First of all, we break up the whole doctrine of creation. Genesis is about the doctrine of is about God creating one whole cosmos, and God's relational and, you know, act of you might say giving life to that which is not yet life, and bringing into being that which is life, you know, over a period of time. And, you know, the fact that we are Adamah, you know, made from the ground, you know, is, I think, very kind of telling that we are not just falling here out of the sky, you know. We're not like, you know, like descending angels of some sort. We're really earthlings. That's really what we are, Adamah. And it's God who breathes in that life, you know, by which we become person and named as person. And those stories are telling us something about the way God is in relationship to the earth, right? To that which is life-bearing. And I think, you know, there's nothing in that story that contradicts what science tells us. And I think we can't just take biology, you know, of evolution. We have to put the planet Earth within the galaxies, right? You have to take cosmology and biology, I think, as the fuller story, right? So it's what we call big history. So you begin with the Big Bang. And then, you know, after many, 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 many years of long, you know, expanding universe, and a lot of, yes, there's a lot of violence in nature. But fact is, we are here out of that violence, and that itself should be very telling to us, right?
Hmm.
But the Earth is what, 4.2 billion years old or so, right? So we're a relative newcomer in terms of galactic life, or planetary life. And then our species, I mean, this is where anthropology and developmental biology, evolutionary biology will tell us, wow, we have a lot of cousins, Australopithecus, Neanderthalis, and of course you can trace these various lineages of hominids and hominins,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our species is about 140,000 years old. We are really, really new. I mean, relatively new in the whole tree of life, of emerging.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does this contradict what God is doing? Well, absolutely not. I mean, God is creator. We are creation. That's all we're saying. How this creation unfolds, that's what science does. It tells us, in a sense, it tries to understand the mystery of how nature unravels, and you might say unfolds into more complex life. It's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think nature cannot explain itself, for one thing. We can understand how nature does things. We can't understand why. So nature you can't solve the problem of nature with nature. Nature requires an explanation beyond its own existence. And therefore, I do think, Genesis actually provides a very coherent understanding of nature. Does that interfere with Adam and Eve? No, we have to. Galileo said it best. The Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go, right? The Bible is not a science book. It is about relationship with God. And I think it is telling us about something about Homo sapiens sapiens, which would be our species, right? The ones who could have language, who could hear, who could respond. And therefore, yeah, maybe something did, emerge in the higher species of Homo sapiens. Maybe it was a capacity for language. Certainly, there seems to be a greater capacity for freedom, to respond to something beyond the necessities of the immediate environment. So on that hand, I don't think biology does not support monogenism. That one couple is responsible for an entire, genetic defect. If we really hold to that, then really we should solve all the genetic problems of our day. It's not possible, and I think you don't want to be scientifically way off the map just in order to be religiously right. It doesn't make any sense. And truthfully, I think God must be scratching God's head going, why are they doing this? I thought, God is creator and we are creation, meaning that we live in a relationship with God. That's all that's really saying. Mm-hmm. And creation is not a one-time thing, right? God's not a magician or like an abracadabra, like ta-da, I give you life, right? The whole idea is that we exist because God exists, and so we're always being created. Mm-hmm. So the Adam and Eve story, I think, is about there's something about us, that is not yet finished, that's not fully complete, that we do miss the mark, which is what sin is about. Rather than original sin, I'd rather speak about a sin of origin, that we begin in multiplicity. We begin out of a less coherent whole, and we are moving towards a more coherent whole in God. And I think that helps us then, reorient the fact we're not dismissing sin. We are, in a sense, reframing what we have talked about in terms of original sin and not hanging our bootstraps there because we're not done. We are becoming something. Mm-hmm. And so sin, the flip side of sin is creativity. Like you have to pick yourself up and find your way out of, if it's not creative, then you're stuck in sin and it's all over. That is death, by the way. Mm-hmm. Right? And so, natural death, being biological death, is why you and I are here. If there was no death it seems tragic that so many species have to die and so much death has to occur in order for more complex biological life to emerge. But that is actually the way biology works.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say to your friends, keep an open mind. I mean, moving to young creationism maybe is a start, but we do have to be, I think if we're not going to take modern science, modern biology seriously, then we should get rid of our smartphones, our cars, our electricity. We should get rid of everything that is modern convenience, that is built on the tenets of modern science. Because you can't just extrapolate one thing and then throw out, another. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, yes, and we can get to people who are actually making a move towards more primitive ways of being in a moment. But sticking with this thread, so much of what you say resonates. And could you share a little bit about the history of interpretation? In other words, within Christian and Jewish communities over the centuries, was the Adam and Eve story even often taken literally, or was it that more of a phenomenon of the modernist fundamentalist controversy starting like the 19th and 20th centuries?
Yeah, it was not a prominent story in the early church by any means. Certainly in the first few centuries of Christianity, the emphasis was on salvation. And it was on the sense of the wholeness of the Christ, that Jesus has come to recapitulate the whole creation, in a new relationship with God. So Adam and Eve did not, have front row seats in those early periods. Again, I think when we come to Augustine, and his 9 years with the Manichaeans, who were dualists, in which, was good versus evil and body versus spirit. And I think he had a lot of things to deal with in his life, in his own life as well. And so there was a need, as we find the need today. Why do bad things happen to good people? And it was really, the doctrine of original sin really emerged in, the first few centuries. I would say maybe the 3rd and 4th century, certainly with Augustine, to explain evil. People wanted to explain why there's tragedy, and why would a good God allow tragic things to happen? And in a sense, the Adam and Eve story was a myth. It was a story that had some import to it, but the literalism of it really is a modern emphasis. And I would say, the reformers, I think here Luther and Calvin did a fine job of, taking Augustine and putting this emphasis on sin, on original sin, that we are sinners, who stand before God. And so we are so weighed down by our sinfulness, right? And the guilt of the sin that we need God's grace. Like we are completely helpless without God. And, that kind of does not jive entirely with the New Testament. In fact, Jesus is like, the reign of God is within you. Like you have the power within you already, So
right.
I mean,
your faith has made you whole, oftentimes in a moment of healing, which was emphasized in my Pentecostal side of my upbringing. But then the Calvinist side of my upbringing was like, no, we are but worms.
Yeah, exactly. And like, who would want to get up in the morning, when everything is just like, wow, like you're so afraid. And I think what original sin has done for us, it has created a very narrow focus, highly individualistic, inward, moving type of people. And so we have not been attentive to creation. We have not been attentive to, those who are different from us or those who are outside our little clan, as part of God's salvific plan. We don't, I think original sin has extracted the grace of God from us rather than reorienting that grace to something more whole and more fulfilling. And this way, I think it has been a little bit detrimental, if I might say so. Now, I'm not dismissing sin is a reality, because, we do get things wrong. We mess things up. We make wrong choices, clearly. We can reject one another. We can reject things. But that's not the end of the story. The whole idea is we can turn around. Like that grace of God is constantly given to us, right? God is constantly creating us. We're always in an ongoing creation toward new creation. And so here's the good news. Jesus is risen from the dead. Yeah. So there's something new up ahead. right? That's the
Mhm.
whole point. Death is not the end. Life is the end.
Mhm. Yes, yes, beautiful. Well, last question on this thought, which is, Augustine and others did develop this well-refined idea of original sin, but I do believe it was the Apostle Paul who interpreted the Adam and Eve narrative and said that, sin and death entered the world through Adam. So assuming that we do take Adam to be archetypal rather than a literal historical person, and given that death, as you said, is this process of generativity within evolution, I think of it as compost, that what dies before it leaves, fertilizes the ground for what comes next. How do you interpret Paul's understanding of death entering the world through Adam?
Yeah, that's Romans 5:12, I think it is, the
Mhm.
parallel between Adam and Christ. And again, well, I know there has been, some interpretation that, the old Adam died and the new Adam, is Christ and now brings us to life. But again, I don't think, and I'm not a scripture scholar, so don't hold me to this, but I don't think Paul had a literalism there the way we have read that literalism into Paul. I
Mhm.
do think he was setting up a parallel between what was begun in Adam is now fulfilled in Christ. Rather than what went wrong in Adam now is made right in Christ. Those are two different things.
Yeah, I see that distinction. Okay.
Yeah, and I think Paul really was the former. That Adam was the firstborn. Now Christ is the newborn. Right? That which fulfills what Adam initiated. What was beginning with the earthling is now brought into new life into God.
Mhm.
And therefore, I think with Paul, I think we see more of an alpha omega thing, a whole, rather than a parallel track like, oh, too bad Adam, now comes Jesus and yay, we won, all Adamites lost and all Christians won. So, I don't
Right.
think the score is 1-0, you know?
Like Homo sapiens versus the Neanderthals.
Exactly.
Did we kill them off? Was it disease? That's an interesting question going on now in
It
deep
is interesting,
anthropology.
right? Yeah, because I guess there is not a direct lineage between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens,
Hmm.
but there also has been some. Now, I did read somewhere that there was some intermarriage between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I recently heard that too. That is
Yes. So,
fascinating.
if you do ancestry.com or something, his relatives were Neanderthals.
Yes, yeah. I actually had a friend recently discovered. He's like, "Yeah, I'm part Neanderthal." I'm like, I always knew that. Uh, well, and that's a good transition to the other side of the aisle for the materialists in the back row. What I notice about you and your writing and your communication is that you speak about God very freely and matter of factly, and a personal God at that.
Hmm.
And for a lot of folks who are on these deconstruction journeys that many of us have been on, where we're rethinking the certitudes that we're born with, and that disappoint us in so many ways, socially, politically, in terms of theological coherence, in terms of the character and nature of God, and the implications of the images of God that many of us received in our
Yeah.
childhoods that are really quite tyrannical if we
Hmm.
get down to it. For a lot of my friends, God has, been part of the baby that gets washed out in the bathwater. Like
Yeah.
it's no longer compelling for them to use God language to even describe their spiritual journeys.
Right.
For some of my friends, they become outright, atheists,
Right.
non-theists,
Yeah.
influenced by, Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or some of these communicators. And others, take a more I would say sophisticated approach, taking a more of a postmodern perspective. And one of these folks is a dear friend of mine, Michael Dowd. I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know if you're familiar with Michael's work with Thank God for Evolution.
Yeah.
Okay, and
I
so
know a little bit. Yeah.
okay, so Michael, he talks about day language and night language.
Mhm.
For him, day language is the revelation, the ongoing revelation of science. That day language is what we discover by experiment, what we discover by consensus. It's what we can, truly unite around as a species, as a people. And night language is the language of metaphor, and it's the language of sacred scripture for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so he speaks of God, but he speaks of God as personification of what is. So
Mm.
I don't know if he would, quite agree with what I'm about to say, but I would say that he's a pantheist who,
Mm.
sees God as the universe, and that yes, we can speak of God in a personalized way as a persona, but it never quite feels like he fully believes that.
Yeah.
And so for you, I noticed you speak, quite freely of a personal God. And so a lot of my friends, especially as they dive into science, and especially as they adopt sort of what seems to be in the air in terms of pop science communication, is a very reductive,
Yeah.
materialist view of reality, that there's nothing more than what we can see with our mundane five senses. So
Yeah.
how do you, as a scientist, as a theologian, as a spiritual practitioner, how did you retain your personal God, or did your personal God become reborn through your studies?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, well, I mean, truthfully, I mean, just working backwards in this question, I actually found God in the lab. I didn't leave God in the lab. And it was really, anyone who's really done science, I mean, scientific research, it is just truly, truly awesome. Just how, even if you take one brain neuron, one cell in the brain, and you look inside that cell, you put it under an electron microscope and you blow up that cell 200,000 times. It is absolutely astounding to see the incredible organization down to the way protein channels open and close and allowing the full function of a single cell. Now, mind you, we have 100 trillion of these in the brain. So science, anyone who's really, I think, a true scientist will be humble about the limits of science. Science is always, in fact, I've always thought that science itself was a type of spirituality, because the scientist is always drawn not by what they know, but what they don't know. It's always, the minute you discover something, you're on to the next set of questions. But why? Why this and not that? And how did this, how could this be this way? So science is an endless pursuit of unbelievable depth of nature itself. And I guess, so I'm always I chuckle a little bit, quite honestly, at the reductionistic thing, because I think anyone who knows anything about the human body, for example, I mean, to say my neurons made me do it is, or it's all in my DNA, really, that, at the heart of things, what does that really mean? Since, you are just an incredible, entangled, endless depth of energy and chemicals and reactions and relationships that are just mind-boggling, truthfully.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question of God, I think, is not just a projection of, that which we are. I think just the opposite. It's actually the depth of what we are that's constantly pulling us toward it. In other words, we are constantly asking questions. Paul Tillich, I think, is one of the most insightful theologians of the 20th century, who said anyone who asks a question about depth or future or beauty or goodness, that person cannot be an atheist. In fact, in Tillich's view, there is no truth, no such thing as atheism, because, as he says, God is not a being, God is being, right? That is what Exodus 3:14 tells us. I am. So God is not just being, God is the being of being, the depth of being, the horizon of being, that which no other being or no other, thought about being could ever be thought. So we can never grasp God. We can never even approach God, but we are always, if we allow ourselves open to, in a sense, this mystery, which not only is before us as we look at a sunset or the incredible majesty of the mountains or even a tree. I love trees, and I love to look at the beauty of their symmetry, the way the leaves flow. I mean, who could create, I mean, even virtual reality, as but best as it tries, there's something about the organic tree that draws me to itself. And it's the treeness of the tree
Mhm.
that is the endless horizon of God.
Mhm.
And that's what we're saying. You see, so God is not some like, certainly God is not the elderly gentleman, right? Over the sky, hovering over all the little children here on earth. God is the infinite horizon, the endless beauty of beauty, the endless goodness of goodness. And that endless beauty and goodness we know in the depth of our own being. And, if we say, well, how can I talk about a personal God? Because I know that God within the depths of my own self. And that's because myself is really no self, right? I mean, even to talk about an I, like as if I might actually have something that belongs to me. We know when we enter into that I that it starts to dissolve more and more. It's elusive, right? Where is the I that I thought I have?
Mhm.
And it starts to kind of slip away. And as we allow ourselves to be slipped into the I-ness of the I, we meet the thou, right? That infinite depth at the very heart of our own lives. And that's why I think, the mystical path into that depth, as we allow ourselves to move beyond, what the Buddhists would say, the illusions of materiality, insofar as because it's elusive, because we think this is it, as crummy as it is. And, when we move into the depths of things, we realize, no, maybe it isn't it. There's a moreness to this it. What God is. God is always the more. God is the more at the heart of our lives, if we allow ourselves to be grasped by that moreness. And God is the more at the heart of every aspect of life, every person, every leaf, every tree, and always the horizon. Ronner calls the horizon of transcendence. And so Ronner's notion, that there's something about, we're drawn to that horizon, and we're drawn in the relentless questions we have. Why do we keep talking about this at all? If God doesn't exist, why bother? I mean, hey, go have a beer or something, and put your feet up and call it a day, right? But we're driven because, as St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, oh God, And that's the amazing mystery in the very depths of our own lives. We're driven by that which is already in us and which already has us in its embrace.
I love how you're using mystery as the starting off point instead of the end point, because I feel like so many of my materialist friends have heard that a million times before in evangelical apologetics, like, oh, well, it's a mystery, and it's sort of a God of the gaps idea. Like, we don't know how this tree can, find its symmetry, therefore God. And I think that atheist philosophers and scientists of materialist bent try to counter that. I think of Howard Bloom's book, The God Problem, how a godless cosmos creates. That there are people who are figuring out a solution that feels coherent to them, of how emergent nested creativity from below could generate everything that we see without the necessity of a creator at the beginning. But with your emphasis in process thought, it sounds like you're seeing God more as the lure, the event horizon of becoming that permeates everything.
I think so, because, truthfully, I mean, I take finite contingency seriously, right? Everything is finite and it's contingent. Everything is dependent on everything else. And therefore, if it really was a self-sufficient universe, like a godless universe, why then, how would we account for direction in evolution? How would we account for complexity at all? Why should anything move? Why do two things attract? Why do people fall in love? Why should that happen at all? There's no really good reason, certainly from the point of biology. I mean, you can't say my neurons made me do it, or, I fell in love because, I'm XY and she's XX or something. I mean,
right.
It just, those answers don't even satisfy us. We know that they fall limp. And so, I just think if we can get over our need to, because I think we have this old God, we got to get rid of the old God. And here I'm with Meister Eckhart. I pray God to get rid of God, to tell the truth. Will the real God please, step out of your horizon of transcendence and come forward? And I think that's what's always happening to us. I think God is constantly coming to us. I think that's what Genesis is always about, by the way. When, God looking for Adam and Eve in that garden, it's like God is constantly coming to us, because God comes to us from the future, from that which is not yet, because God is the infinite possibilities of all that can be. It's a name that points to that which no greater can be thought. That's the whole thing. We ontologize that name. We give that name a body and a face, and that name has, we like it and we don't like it. It's just a name that points to a mystery of incomprehensible life. That's at the heart of our lives, that keeps drawing us. And I just find evidence all over the place for the existence of God, simply by the sheer inability to rest comfortably with consumerism, careerism, scientism. All the isms just do not satisfy us. We go through all of them, and we're constantly searching. We're restless searchers, anxious searchers.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that restless search and that draw of polarity and of love, let's talk about the Trinity for a couple minutes.
Okay.
I was privileged to work with Father Richard Rohr on the Divine Dance, the Trinity and the Transformation, and it was generally well received, but we did catch some flack from some quarters of, y'all aren't focusing so much on the historical person of the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and you're focusing more on the relationship between, or the space between, the dynamism. And when I read you on the Trinity, especially drawing from Bonaventure, it feels like maybe you would have been able to dodge those charges. Like, you do speak specifically of those persons, but you also seem to have the flow of love between clearly in mind. So why does the Trinity matter to you?
Well, I think really because, I take the New Testament revelation, God is love, seriously, and I think that's what Jesus is about. I think Jesus is the revelation of God as love. In fact, he gives us that law of love, right? And therefore love cannot be a monad, right? Love cannot be a person. That love by its very nature is plural and personal. So, going back to Richard of St. Victor and, Bonaventure and others, that love is always the movement out of one toward the other, right? The movement of the good from one to the other. And as Richard of St. Victor said, if it's just two persons in love, it can be selfish. Now, truthfully, I think wherever there's true love, there's always a third, right? There's always that bond between. That bond, it's two persons in love, but there's something that's so real between them that it's not just the two persons. There's a third there, right? A media res, and that's the Spirit, right? That's the person of the Spirit. And I think when we talk about Trinity, that's what we're saying, that God is not just self-gifting love, expressing that in a personal way in the Son or the Word, however we see that person of expression. But that love is so vibrant and dynamic and real. There's something that bonds them together, and that bonding together is that life of the Spirit. So Trinity, as Beatrice Bouteau said, is the minimum number of persons for love to be actualized. And therefore, I think we really do have to maybe be a little bit open, because again, we take everything so literally. We ontologize the literary thing. What if God is thousands of persons, right? Three is a symbolic number of God as love. We limit poor God of just Father, Son, and Spirit, and then we have to make sure that, that the Spirit is feminine because we have the Father masculine, so we got to balance the genders there. And we so anthropomorphize God. It's amazing God has anything to do with us. But I think we have to just take that, root reality of love as that absolute that the absolute beingness of God is self-giving, it's relational, it's personal. And three, Trinity, is the minimum number for agapic love, right? For outward, dynamic, self-gifting love, which makes God, I think, very deeply relational, deeply involved in all that God brings into being, right? God's not a deist kind of, God's not like a clockmaker, a watchmaker, a chess player, a self-thinking subject. All I find to be very male images in some ways, very intellectual. Like God is like a giant computer programmer or something, God is really, and truthfully, if I could put it in here, I find, if we were to really be honest about it, because we never talk about this, but I think that love of God is deeply sexual. In other words, God as, deeply involved and really requiring a response of involvement in love. It's not like a head thing, you can't think about it.
Right.
You must immerse your whole person into it. Pseudo-Dionysius in the 5th century spoke of God as erotic love. He spoke of God's love as sober drunkenness. God as a drunk, so intoxicated. He used the language of intoxication. God so in love, and therefore like just stumbling over in love for creation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that you and Beatrice Brutteau and others are onto something with three being the minimum viable number. I think of how, in the animal kingdom, including us, pair bonding often produces a third, sort of biologically speaking. And in certain esoteric systems of thought, when people are joining together in their intention or, their energies, they create what some call like an energetic child together. There's this fecundity to coming together, and it doesn't always happen biologically, but it does seem to happen spiritually, that there's this generativity that occurs.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's about fecundity, right? And that's why I think the Spirit is that love. The Spirit of God is that love. And that, where you're in a gathering or you're sharing something, when you share something with someone in a deep way, a deep spiritual way, it is a fecundity of unity and oneness that even physical union, can't even, get itself, wrapped around. So there's something about that ecstatic love, that standing outside yourself, which is that deep spiritual fecundity of love that I think is what we're called into.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. There's a whole tangent that I don't think we'll be able to get into today that I want to talk with you about sometime, relating to the idea of Teilhard's omega point and the momentum of evolution. It's certainly a lot of what you got into with your interview with my friend Micah on the Christian Transhumanist podcast.
Yes.
I want to eventually talk about, are there limits to growth or limitations to our ideas of progress? What can we learn from the permaculture community and eco-village communities? But you know what? I think I want to save that for my upcoming Rewilder podcast.
Okay, very good.
So let's definitely have you on that. But look, why don't we close out today with maybe some thoughts that really ground this in practicality for our viewers here and our book club members. Yeah. You speak in your essay in the book about being a second axial age theologian, about how, the first axial age several thousand years ago was this global religious and spiritual awakening to personal responsibility. And this next axial age is all about becoming and about interdependence, and you seem to allude to even the categories of religion itself potentially having serious limitations. And so I'm wondering for you, like on a praxis level, on a practical level, how does the specificity of the Christian lineage inform you in being a second axial age theologian, and where do you see universality or a convergence of momentum amongst different traditions happening, not only in the academy, not only philosophically, but what do you see already happening or possible with regards to community gathering, spiritual practices, etc.?
Yeah, no, a great question. I mean, I do think Jesus was a second axial person, even though he's a first axial figure. But I think he brought in a new consciousness that of inclusivity, of community, you might say an ecology of wholeness, a Catholicity, if you will, a wholeness,
Mm-hmm.
not Catholic in institution, but Catholic as a consciousness of the whole,
Mm-hmm.
that we have not yet caught up to. So I think he was proleptic in that way. He anticipated what we are called into. And we're still trying to figure out, how to be a Christian and go to heaven. And I think I think in all honesty, I think the incarnation is a great idea. We just haven't really caught on to its full meaning. So that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that as a second axial Christian, I'll speak on two levels. One, I think the church itself, the institutional church, but here I take both Catholic and Protestant churches, as we're seeking to move beyond to something that is more unified. And there's a real struggle here. I think there's a lot of institutionalization, a lot of politicization that has gone into the formation of the institutional churches it is now unhelpful.
Mm.
And there needs to be some kind of either deconstruction or maybe just some type of revolution or reformation, so to speak, towards something new. Clearly, we're in a global consciousness. We're so aware of our brothers and sisters throughout the world with many different religions. The beauty of the Asian religions, the beauty of Islam, the beauty of Judaism. As I engage in different, and I have engaged over the years in different venues with interreligious venues, and to me it is such a richness to be talking with people of other faith traditions about the things we hold together, about the future of humankind, about the future of the earth, even about God in many of our different ways. So I think the second axial person has to be a person of trust and a person who sees the other person as person. Like there's that God is radiating out of that, in the face of that person without trying to impose on another person, like, you're not a Christian? What? You're going to hell, right? Or, I'm saved and you're not. I just think that is the most deadly kind of position we can hold today. We either share this planet together or not. There's no midway.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, I think the institutions are not helpful to where we need to go in terms of a new type of religion that must emerge out of the traditions, not to get rid of the traditions, but to bring the traditions together into a new sensibility, maybe a new type of consciousness, maybe in a way that we might we might respect the rituals and the myths in the various traditions in new ways, but we have to be creative about religion in the 21st century.
Mm.
And I'm not sure we have quite done that. If we could do what Google does in terms of technology, if we could take their creativity and reinvent ourselves in terms of our religious dimension of life, I think we can have a very fruitful future together. The days of righteousness and self-righteousness, the days of, fighting over doctrine and dogmas, those days have to come to an end. There's been a lot of bloodshed over that, and it will get nowhere, right? And I think science, we're learning from science, the more we enter into the depths of consciousness, we can say at the highest depths, the highest depths of consciousness, all religions are really speaking about basically the same thing, of unity, oneness, and a sense of allness, and beauty, that we name as God, that the Muslims name as Allah, that the Jews name as Yahweh, and so the Asians, the Buddhists name as, Brahman, or so let's find new language, and let's find new ways of being religious together. Because to me, religion is the missing piece in the 21st century world of pluralism, of animosity, of our polarizing tendencies, especially with the populist movements going now, on in politics, we are fracturing, and we're fracturing because religion has not stepped up to the plate to say, wait a minute, there's something deeper here that binds us together. And we need to find ways of tapping into that depth of what binds us together, that we can meet a Muslim or a Jewish brother or sister and say, hey, we're in this together. And so we need to get over whatever our blockades and our walls are. Not build a wall, take down the walls. Take down the walls so we can see one another eye to eye. And I think that's what I think Jesus was about. And I think what love is about. And I think love is our deepest reality. And I think we need to continue to work towards a new religious future.
Well said. Yes, absolutely. We're all in this together. And if we only gave ourselves the permission to see that our religious beliefs don't make us qualitatively different from one another, I think what you said about the mature forms of these various paths, I think have a more of a settled reality. Sometimes I feel like the fundamentalist iterations of our various paths are so frantic and fervent because we're trying to prove something to ourselves, that if we convert enough people, if we, do enough stuff, then our cosmology must be correct. But if the good news in the Christian articulation is the settled news that, God is reconciling the cosmos to God's self, and that Christ is the revelation of that, then there's a certain security and even joy in that. And I can encounter that mystery as present in other faiths as well.
Absolutely. And God is not behind us. God is before us, right? God is always pulling us in the future. And so I think we need to shift our understanding of God as well. I think God delights, by the way, in the variety of religious experiences, in the variety of religious paths. God saw it was all good. God did not say, oh, no, not that one. Uh-oh. And we have become the obstacle to our own positive futures. And we need to get over ourselves, our separated selves, our egotistic selves, and our delusional selves, to know that God is at the heart of us and God goes before us. And I think if we can trust that God, we can have a new future together.
Getting out of our own way. Amen. Well, thank you so much, Ilia, for spending this time with us. And if folks want to find out more about your work, what's the best website to go to?
Omegacenter.info.
Omegacenter.info. And we will include that in the notes for this episode as well.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And Cosmic Campers, we will see you soon for our next conversations.